this last year, if you live in the US, you may have noticed a few things. Nearly empty dealer lots, higher prices for used cars in general, and large markups for the few new cars remaining at dealerships. But all have their roots in the same issue. There simply aren't enough cars available on the marketplace to meet demand from buyers, whether they be new or used. Why is that? Some people will say it's the chip shortage that's causing delays in manufacturing, while others will blame the broader COVID supply chain issues in general. But this is an issue that has been fermenting for years, and these two things only made worse a problem that was bound to get worse at some point anyway. A big reason car prices are so high is the 2009 car allowance rebate system, better known as cash for clunkers. It was a key policy component of the U.S. government's response to the economic downturn of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, and it was designed with the following aims. Number one, to stimulate the economy at a time when consumer spending was down. Number two, to help boost sales for GM and Chrysler to improve their cash flow, critical given that they were in bankruptcy proceedings and had just accepted bailout money from the U.S. government. And number three, to increase the average fuel efficiency of vehicles on American roads. The basic idea of this program was that if you traded in an older, fuel-inefficient car for the purchase of a new, more fuel-efficient model, then the federal government would subsidize the purchase of said vehicle to the tune of either $3,500 or $4,500, depending on how much more fuel-efficient the new car was relative to the old one traded in. The old car would then be scrapped and removed from the vehicle fleet, so as to ensure that it would not continue to pollute. In theory, it sounds okay. In practice, it accomplished none of the desired effects. In a study on the effects of the program, link in the description below, 360,000 additional cars were sold in July and August of 2009, compared if the policy hadn't been implemented. This, however, was offset by a sharp decline in car sales 7 months later. Translation: the additional sales attributed to cash for clunkers mostly represented buyers that would have purchased a new car anyway, but did so sooner rather than later so they could get the rebate while it lasted. In aggregate, it means that additional sales of new cars were net zero overall. And that's in the best case scenario. Other studies have even suggested that this program in fact resulted in a net drop of new car sales for the year. However, it gets worse. The two companies that requested financial assistance, GM and Chrysler, only accounted for a quarter of the sales made in the program. And the only US-made cars to get spots on the top 10 on the Cash for Clunkers sales chart were Fords. And they didn't even request any bailout money in the first place. Am I blaming people for not buying GM or Chrysler products at the time? No! American cars of the 1990s and 2000s were complete pieces of crap. I would never recommend anybody buy them, then and now. But that isn't the point. If the goal was to help struggling American automakers improve sales, to get out of a bad situation they were in, and stimulate the wider economy, Cash for Clunkers spent an awful lot of money to accomplish absolutely nothing. However, what about improving the fuel efficiency of vehicles on American roads? On this regard, the policy could have been argued to be a success. But the problem is that any improvement in the fuel economy of vehicles on American roads is the result of a trend that predates Cash for Clunkers. And furthermore, by preventing the components of vehicles traded in under this program from being recycled in any meaningful way, the U.S. government likely increased carbon emissions, because most carbon emissions from a car come from its initial production. And as I said before in my article on RationalMotoring.com explaining why buying a Tesla is a bad idea, you cannot consume your way out of a problem consumption created in the first place. This is because even if a few 100,000 more fuel-efficient vehicles are sold, there are nearly 200 million cars on the roads of America, so any meaningful change in fuel economy and emissions will take a long time to materialize. However, the worst part of this program was its impact on the car market in general. Through the Cash for Clunkers program, nearly 750,000 cars were scrapped. And one of the conditions of this program was that the engines of the cars were to be destroyed, preventing the car from ever running again. Nor could other parts be salvaged off these cars per the program's requirements, again contributing to rising emissions due to additional recycling and production. But more importantly, also making repairs more expensive on existing cars. The caveat is that the absolute cheapest of cars that would have been available were instead scrapped under the scale. Unfortunately, outside the unaffordable urban cores of older East Coast cities, the reality for most Americans, rich and poor, is that if you want to get anywhere, you have to drive. This, in practice, adds a buy-in price for economic participation in America, as getting to any resource, whether it be work, food, or entertainment, you gotta own a car. While this cost is easier to bear for the shrinking middle class and above, it is a big problem made even more difficult for the poor. Often, these people are working minimum wage, low-skill service jobs that cannot be done remotely. You don't show, your manager fires you and you are replaced the next day. But wait, there's more. In America, if a person loses their job, they also lose their health insurance and other benefits. And for people with a condition like diabetes that necessitates insulin, or some other condition that necessitates some other medication, no health insurance renders medications unaffordable in most cases. Cutting off their access means you may as well be handing them a death sentence. This means even those least able to afford a car must have one if they want to keep their heads above water or even have a chance to keep their heads above water. And they need the absolute cheapest of cars so they can still afford to eat and pay rent. What types of cars do Cash for Clunkers disproportionately take off the road in large numbers? Why, the cheap beers that were the only cars the poorest Americans could barely afford in the first place, of course. And it's not like car prices have become more affordable since then either. They haven't. Since 2008, new car prices have gone up 66%. And the average selling price of a new car is on track to surpass $50,000 next year should current trends continue. And in an environment where nominal wages have remained stagnant for a half century, buying a new car is harder to stomach than ever. This means there is more competition for the few used cars remaining, further pushing up prices and making life more difficult for the poor. So why are cars so expensive now? Why is there a shortage? Once again, it boils down to a failed U.S. government policy, publicly touted as a means to save the country, but in reality, it was thinly veiled corporate welfare that ended up screwing over the poorest Americans. And once again, the politicians, being politicians, claimed victory on top of the ash heap. Surprise!